Yeah, we can see that.
All of the beautiful faces. All right.
Well, how about going to Puerto Rico? We have a couple of tracks from there. One rootsy, and then one from New York City that took the roots and did something special with
That's
it.
appropriate. Let's start with roots first.
Okay.
Is that the video?
This is like the middle of the podcast. There's like a lot of places where they're talking and they're introducing, and so this is like the middle part where they'll be introducing a little bit of music from Puerto Rico, but it has some good things. The whole podcast is really interesting.
And that kind of reminds me, though, speaking on the video, we're going to open up with a short, I think like 5 minutes video, and then we'll do all the introductions and dive right in. The video is a really cool precursor.
He heard the kind of music called
and we are live. Nice.
Like all the time.
We got 10 folks
growing up,
nice.
It's played in the streets. It's played particularly around Christmas time.
And as people are coming in,
and he took that.
This is just a podcast from NPR celebrating the Afro-Latinx community with their music and the background of it.
Without the jingles, they're called panderetas. And those three drums interlock in a kind of a bass rhythm, a very West African thing.
People are coming in, super excited to have you here.
Contributions to culture here, and that is so clearly of African-based idea. And he formed a group called Bientot de Agua. That Bientot de Agua, as Tito
As we have our guests coming in, we're going to be listening to an NPR podcast celebrating the music behind the Afro-Latinx community.
So that's the namesake of this group here. But he has two versions, plugged and unplugged.
Que la gente salga corriendo del zoológico y dímelo. Se escapó un león, y eso es lógico. Que la gente salga corriendo del zoológico. Se escapó un león.
And as people are coming in, welcome. We're so excited to have you all here. We're listening to an NPR podcast celebrating the music from the Afro-Latinx community, and we'll just give it a couple more minutes while people are still coming in.
Y eso es lógico, que la gente salga corriendo del zoológico. Que no. So the lion escaped from the zoo, and it's logical that all the people would go running out of the zoo, right? So that's the refrain, and then Tito improvises on the small pandereta called requinto, and really hits the thing. He just really is right on in this plane, in both first improvisation and his drum improvisation.
We'll just give it a couple more minutes as people are coming in, and then we can get started.
The story of El León that escaped from the zoo from Tito Matos, y Bientot de Agua unplugged. While we're still in Puerto Rico, let's go on to the next track you brought in from the island.
Right. This is has people from the island, but they live in New York. The group was founded In New York, the name is Los Planeros de la 20, but music.
Baila bien, baila con la punta del pie. Julia Luisa baila bien, baila con la punta del pie. Y mira qué bonito baila, como yo siempre soñé. Julia Luisa baila bien, baila con la punta del pie. Julia Luisa goza que la bomba, con ella yo te pie. Julia Luisa baila bien, baila con la punta del pie. Con Paula Luis, José Andrés, recuerdo de...
All right. Hello, everyone. So glad to have you all here.
Awesome. Well, we are going to allow people to get in, but we're going to get started with our program to make sure we are honoring everybody's time today. So we want to welcome everybody to the Voicing Afro-Latinx Histories and Identities. We have a great expert panel. I've done research, lived experiences, and just really diving in about the Afro-Latinx identities and sharing their knowledge. And so we are very grateful for them to be here. I want to acknowledge all of the departments who are sponsoring this event. We have from our College of Education and Human Development, our Department for Race, Ethnicity, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, and all the professors and doctors here from that department. So thank you so much. We also have our Multicultural Center for Equity and Justice here. So thank you as well. And then lastly, but not least, our Leadership and Volunteer Services. So thank you for everybody being a part of this program and being a part of Black History Month and really talking about these topics. So I'm going to hand off the mic to Vincent and going over our land acknowledgement.
Good afternoon, or maybe right at noon, everyone. We're going to do a brief land acknowledgement, just acknowledging the indigenous tribes and natives that inhabited this land. And so here in the Bexar County, San Antonio area, we got the Coahuiltecans for many, many years. And then later, the umbrella term used was the South Texas Plains Indians, but that included the Lipan Apaches, Tonkawa, Comanches, Yanaguana, and several other tribes. We also want to acknowledge, given the topic that we're going to be discussing today, all indigenous lands across the Americas, the Caribbean, and we'll talk a little bit more in our history segment about what some of that might look like in forming the identity we're speaking on. But we just want to briefly do that land acknowledgement to honor those individuals who used to inhabit this land, and some of which still do.
Just as some housekeeping rules, there is a Q&A feature here on Zoom. So if you do have any questions for our panelists, feel free to drop that in and we will ask them and get that going. If anybody has any questions or needs any help navigating, feel free to also drop it in the chat. If you have any colleagues who cannot get into the Zoom, we have people on backup to help you all get in. And then for any of our students who are on the call, we are going to drop a link in the chat. If you can check in for us, and just so we can track that attendance. I know some of y'all may be looking for some credit in some classes, and we want to verify that you all were here. So we'll be dropping that in the chat as well. And now I'm going to hand it back over to Victoria to do our video introduction.
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to be here. Super excited to be a part of this program as well, and to be an ally and just learn more about the Afro-Latinx community. Before we get started today with our panelists, we are going to jump into this video with Lala Anthony, really kind of explaining a little bit more of the background and the being Black, Latino, and proud, and kind of what that means and some of the history to really kick us off today with our conversation. So let's go ahead and get started.
Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm Lala Anthony.
Can you
here
all
to talk
hear?
about and celebrate Afro-Latinx.
All right, awesome.
In our food, music, politics, and literature, Afro-Latinos have played a huge role in shaping Latin America and U.S. culture. But these contributions are frequently overlooked, and the size and influence of our community doesn't get the recognition they deserve. Why are there so many misconceptions about Black Latino identity? To find some answers, we need to look at our histories of colonization. Many in the U.S. would be surprised to know that roughly 95% of Africans who were enslaved and survived the Middle Passage were brought to Latin America and the Caribbean. That's right. Today, the Black population in Latin America is actually way bigger than in the U.S. But racial identities develop in different ways in these two regions, which influence how Afro-Latinidad is perceived. See, while all European colonies were founded on white supremacy, their differing approaches to race had a huge impact on the way colonized people self-identified. The Spanish created a caste system for racial mixtures, where Blackness was at the bottom, whiteness was at the top, and several racial categories lay in between. How many of us have grown up hearing the phrase mejorar la raza? That's where the idea comes from. The lighter skin leads to better social status. As Latin America emancipated from Europe and established new nations, they relied on a narrative that mestizaje, the mixing of races and cultures, would create the ideal citizen. They believed that racial mixing would eventually bleach out the Black and Indigenous and encourage immigration from European nations to speed up the process. A myth of racial democracy took hold across the region. Many argue that racial mixing itself shows an absence of prejudice and therefore racism cannot exist. But this ideology masks the reality that darker-skinned Latin Americans face systematic discrimination and colorism to this day, which includes unequal access to housing, education, wealth, and political power, as well as beauty ideals that favor European features. In the English colonies, things took shape differently. There was non-consensual mixing between the races there too, but rather than promote mixing, interracial marriage was illegal. And after the US established independence, it created a legal system of segregation to keep Black and white people separate in public spaces. This contributed to the development of a Black-white binary view of race. In the US, the idea that you can be Black and Latino is often confusing to a population trained to conflate race, nationality, and ethnicity. People think Latino equals tan skin and Black equals African American only. And because of anti-Blackness, both US and Latin American societies uphold this perception. But in the real world, Black Latinos and African heritage we carry are essential to Latin American culture and identity. It's in our textured hair or the African drums used in cumbia, merengue, and salsa rhythms, to the global phenomenon of reggaeton, in dances like palos, bomba, or samba, in the Afro-diasporic religions that exist across Latin America, like Santeria and Haitian voodoo. And Afro-Latinos have shaped US culture and history too. Puerto Rican scholar Arturo Schomburg is considered one of the fathers of Black history and played an important role in the Harlem Renaissance. Cuban American John Carlos was one of the athletes who lifted his fist in a Black Power salute at the 1968 Olympics. Activist and professor Miriam Jimenez Roman played a huge part in shaping our country's understanding of Latinidad. We didn't just make individual contributions, we started movements. In the 1960s, civil rights group the Young Lords, emerged and inspired by the Black Panthers, fought to protect community rights. The New Yorican movement produced poetry and art that recognized Afro and Afro-Taino history. Afro-Cuban rhythms influenced jazz and R&B. And it was Puerto Ricans, Caribbeans, and African Americans in the Bronx who created hip hop in the 70s and 80s, drawing from their shared struggles. The movement to recognize the experiences and contributions of Black Latinos across Latin America and in the US keeps growing. We celebrate our natural hair. We affirm our Black identity in politics and music and literature. So if we want a more inclusive future, let's start by learning our shared history and honoring Afro-Latinos' place in the culture.
All right, and thank you so much for watching and starting off that. We're super excited to kind of dive into a lot of these topics that was mentioned in the video today with our wonderful panelists that are here to discuss and to help us understand more about the Afro-Latinx community. So thank you so much for being here today. We can go around and have our panelists introduce themselves. If you could say your name, your pronouns, and a little bit about what you do. And we can just popcorn around. So whoever wants to get us started, but we're so excited to have you all here today.
I could definitely start. Hello, my name is Reyna Genlis. I'm a very recent 2020 graduate from NC State. I currently spend most of my time writing for Women Advance, which is a place for women and gender nonconforming people to basically write articles and essays on personal experiences. And I generally like to talk a lot about my experiences as a Haitian woman and as an Afro-Caribbean woman as well. And my pronouns are she, her. Sorry.
And then
I'll
whoever's
go
next.
next. I'll go next. Good afternoon to all. My name is Dr. Mark Perry. I'm an associate professor of African American Studies in the Department of Race, Ethnicity, Gender, and Sexuality Studies here at UTSA. I'm originally from New York, on my way to Texas, and super excited about this exchange. My pronouns are he, his, and him.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, I guess I can go next. My name is Mario Marcel Salas, professor. I retired as an assistant professor of political science, and because I have 2 graduate degrees, I teach in the education department, teaching African American studies and also in political science, teaching civil rights and American politics this semester. And I've been very active in the civil rights movement for a very long time. I was a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee back in the 60s. And also a member of the Black Panther Party back in the 60s as well. So, and I consider myself an Afro-Mexican. So that's, we're gonna have a good time today.
I'm excited. Thank you.
My name is Marcos Cervantes. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Race, Ethnicity, Gender, and Sexuality Studies and the Mexican American Studies program here at UTSA. I research Black and Brown sonic convergences and political solidarity. I'm also a hip hop artist by the name of Mex Step, and I'm a member of the group Third Root.
Thank you so much.
Hola, mi gente. My name is Janel Caminos. I am of Puerto Rican descent. I work at Harris Health System in Houston as an HR professional. I'm also the founder of Rizos Travel and author of Curly Gal Affirmations.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We're super excited to get started with conversation. And now I will pass it off to Vince.
All righty, panelists, thank you so much. Let's go ahead and dive right in. And we're going to start off talking about historical touch points. So Professor Salas, if you want to kick us off, and then we can go from there.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here, and good afternoon to everyone. Well, one thing I always like to do is start off with the problems with names and naming. And of course, when you say Afro-Latinx, very few people know what that means. Now, I suspect over time, it's going to become more widespread, but it is gender neutral, and others will get more into that as we go along. But the point I'd like to emphasize for some discussion is people who have been conquered, or people who have been the victims of colonialism under white supremacist structures, always have some problem with identification. So that you go through these different modes. In Texas, for example, at first you're a dirty Mexican, and then later on you become a Mexican American, and then later on, because there's this trouble of identity, later on you become Hispanic, later on you become Latino or Latina, later on, and so it's the same in the Black community. The N word is the beginning in some cases, or before that, your African tribal identity. And then it goes from colored to Negro to African American or to Black, then African American, and then we're back to Black, so to speak, and not intending to rhyme there, but back to Black. So if you're colonized, if you've been a victim of white supremacy, then you always have these problems with name ID. Or how you identify self, as opposed to being identified by the conquerors. And so, and this happens with every group, including Europeans. They need a white history class, by the way, because many whites were, of course, Irish and German and French and Italian before they were white, and collapsed into this box of whiteness. So a thorough understanding of how white supremacy works, especially with people who are of mixed heritage. I don't like to use the word race because there's only one race, it's human. We all have different ethnicities and cultures. And so I like to look at it from that standpoint. So these terms are very important, and then understanding the touch points. I mean, I believe Dr. Perry was pointing out before we got on the air about the number one place where many people of African ancestry live in parts of South America, and he'll be talking about that more. But also, we never think in terms of the diaspora and the triangular trade, hyperbolized triangle, so to speak, between the African continent, the Caribbean, South America, and then eventually the United States, or America, North America. And so we need to understand that. I mean, most people don't even know there are Afro-Chileans and Afro-Ecuadorians and Afro-Argentines and Afro this and Afro that. They don't get it. And oftentimes because of religion, they get collapsed into a religious language kind of setup, in which if you're speaking Spanish and you, in the case of the Spaniards, if you're speaking Spanish and you've adopted Catholicism, even if you're faking it, if you've adopted Catholicism, then you get to become Hispanic. And we have these differences. You know, I can still go to the valley down in South Texas and run into people who still refer to themselves as Mexican American. They reject the term Hispanic. One friend of mine even said, I'm not, Hispania comes from the Romans. I'm not a Roman, so I reject that term. And so he had a point. So there's these conflicts of terms of self-identification imposed upon people of color through religion and through colonialism and through the adaptation of racial structures, white supremacist racial structures, and how people identify themselves. So this is one thing I think we need to address at some point. And then just for fun, I'll throw in a few other things for Afro-Mexicans. Most of us have heard in the academic community, at least now, I wouldn't say this is widespread across the Hispanic or Latinx community, but Mexico had a Black president, Vicente Guerrero. That's not fully well known across, and I can still mention it to people in my classes and they're like shocked. They don't know it. They still don't know it. So we can't take for granted any of the things that we know about. Our Santa Anna's all Black regiment, Los Morenos Libres de Veracruz. We don't know anything about that. And so these things are totally important. Nor do we know about the terms Afro-Indio. I mean, there's a bunch of different terms: Afro-Mexican, Afro-Indio, Afro-Mestizo. I mean, you could go on and on and on. And so all these things have to be deconstructed so that we know how they came into being and get a much fuller picture of what's going on. So I'm going to segue into, maybe people want to jump in, and because there's just so much to talk about, including people's last names. Prieto, Moreno, these are casta names, and you can find these casta systems. My God, you find a Mexican casta system or a Spanish casta system that existed in Mexico, and a totally different set of names that apply to a casta system based on skin color and race in Peru, a different casta system in other parts, in Colombia and what have you. So you can look at these hundreds of different names and see how they vary from one country to the next, depending on how the paradigm was set up and how they could be above or make their way out of slavery, depending upon religious influences, skin color, and all of that. So also very important to understand. Is your last name Medina? That's an Arabic word. That's not a Hispanic word. Last name, rather, surname. It's Arabic. And so we have to tie in all this stuff. And there is some understanding that in Spain, they don't like to refer themselves as Latino at all. The Hispanic is the thing for them. And well, the Romans did that. So Hispania. So we have to look at all of these constructions, how they fill in on other people's culture, and then how people started to identify themselves in that particular way. And then the subject of how does it feel to be Afro-Mexican? How does it feel to be Afro-Latinx when you're living between two different worlds? When you're rejected as a Black person, but also rejected as someone that's Hispanic, so to speak. And then what it's like to live that way. and how you grew up in a society that didn't see these different shades of ethnicities, but only saw boxes that that white supremacy placed people in. And then we talk about other things as well. It must have been a total shock to Anglo settlers coming from Tennessee to see people who were very dark in Mexico, which is what Texas was at one time, who didn't fit into the box of either black or white. And so this creates another issue as well that went past hundreds of years, and people are still saying these things and doing these things and thinking in concepts that are totally out of sync with the historical record. And having said that much, I'm going to stop and hope that generated some conversation.
Excellent. Thank you, sir. And I know we had also, you kind of mentioned it there, it might be a good segue. You mentioned the denying like the different identities of the Afro-Latinx population. I wonder if anyone else would like to kind of expand a little bit more on that, talking about the erasure, and specifically the erasure of the Blackness of the Afro-Latinx identity, but also other pieces of that as well.
Thank you, Vincent. And just real quick, white supremacy learned a long time ago how to write history with an erasure.
I can jump in. First of all, I want to say that that video that was opened up, I thought was very good. So big props to folks who found that video. I actually want the link because I want to use that to teach. I think it does a really, really great, concise job of kind of introducing the kind of complexities of kind of Afro-Latinx or Afro-Latinidad. And so in some ways to kind of pick up and echo what Professor Salas was talking about, in part, we have to understand, of course, that race fundamentally is a social construction. I mean, right, that's where this conversation really needs to start, right? We have to understand that race was not divined by God, it was made by men. And it was men indeed who created it through conquest, colonialism, and chattel slavery, right? The enslavement of people of African descent. And it was created for a very particular reason. It was, first of all, created around this idea of white supremacy, of course, but also tied to economic systems of exploitation, right? The conquistadors came with the cross and the sword in their hands, and they came to the Americas to conquer, right? To transform land into some sort of resources for the crown, right? To send it back to Europe. And in order to transform land into resources, you have to have labor, right? So immediately there's a need for a very particular kind of labor that's going to be one that's going to be brutal. And the first kind of category of racialization occurs in that context is indigenous peoples, right? They were called Indians, right? This idea that Christopher Columbus somehow got lost and started calling people indigenous peoples of the Americas, all of them and all their incredible cultural and historical diversity, Indians, right? And that becomes one of the first kind of racialized categories, right? That is tied to conquest and colonialism, right? So if we want to talk about or understand the kind of history and the basis of Latinidad, we have to recognize that like one of the first racialized categories that comes into play that serves a particular economic and political need is the creation of indigenous peoples as so-called Indians, right? And then the later introduction of people of African descent. Africa itself is a historical construction that actually is a European concept. As I think Professor Salas pointed out, folks consider themselves different ethnic groups, right? They had their different languages, their cultures, they were Igbo, they were Hausa, they were Mandinka, they were Zulu, they were Kikuyu. They were not Africans. African was a category that was created by Europeans to lump all of these different peoples into one category that equaled Negro, which meant black, or negro in Spanish or Portuguese, who then meant that they could be enslaved, right? So we have to understand the kind of foundational relationship between race as a construction and the histories that produce it. And one of the things that I think the video did a very good job at is that it introduced the kind of complexities of racial construction in Latin America was not necessarily the same as it was in North America, which again underscores, again, this idea that race is constructed, that it's created for particular needs at particular historical moments and times. And one of the things I want to point out is this idea of mestizaje that's mentioned in the video, which is extremely important, right? Conquistadors came and the first thing they did is they raped and pillaged. And one of the results of that violence was, in a sense, the emergence of a so-called mixed race person, a mestizo, right? Some of them have mixed race. but that was a product of colonialism and violence, right? And gendered violence, because these were men, right, exercising a particular kind of violence against brown-skinned people, and in particular, in this instance, it was against women, right? So we have to understand, again, not only race, but also gender and class and how all these things mix into the fold, right? So the Mestizaje situation is where we get this idea that in Latin America, everybody is mixed. And of course, in North America, as the video points out, just to underscore, the United States took a very different idea, this idea of hypodescent. You have this white-black binary, where in Latin America, you have this range between blackness and whiteness, whiteness always on the top and black and brownness always at the bottom. And then this range of difference in between of non-whiteness, right? And that in of itself kind of lends itself to this idea of erasing blackness, because if blackness is at the very bottom, who wants to identify with blackness? Everybody wants to try to mejor la raza, right? Make the race better by marrying up, meaning having children with lighter skinned people in order to access that white or lighter skinned privilege, right? So that's a very central part of the way in which blackness historically gets erased in the context of Latin America, because you don't have a clear fixed category of people of African descent being labeled as black. But then again, in terms of the folks who are of African descent, there's this kind of logic, this kind of power that wants you to identify or aspire to whiteness as a way to distance yourself from blackness. So you'll call yourself moreno, jabal, triqueño. There's all these terms that are used throughout Latin America to talk about various gradations of non-whiteness, but not blackness. So this is a critical component of the conversation around how, in a sense, blackness becomes erased or tries to be erased in the context of Latin America. And I'm going to stop there and open it up for anyone else who wants to jump in.
Yeah, I want to add just a little bit off what Dr. Perry was saying. And thank you. I mean, it's a real honor to be on this panel. As a faculty in Mexican American Studies, I think it's critical to emphasize the importance of Black history to Mexican and Chicano history. Growing up in the Texas school system, I was unaware of Mexico's African history, from Gaspar Yanga to the colonial African and indigenous music of Son Jarocho to Afro-Mexicans in the Mexican Revolution, to the second president of Mexico, as Professor Salas mentioned, Vicente Guerrero. He's on the 5-peso bill in Mexico. Veracruz, Mexico was one of the largest ports of entry for enslaved Africans in the Americas. There's a long line of African history in Mexico, though this history is largely absent in our textbooks and courses. I think understanding the systemic processes against this erasure, as Dr. Perry has pointed out, is crucial to combating the racism within Latino communities and abroad. And I'll just overstate, the project of Latinidad was and is a violent project. Rape, violence, genocide. Even the word Latino is based on a Eurocentric imperialistic view of the Americas, as both professors have pointed out. Spain's casta system created a racial order that continues to feed racism and colorism in the US and Latin America. We can see this today in language, Spanish language media and TV, novelas. The celebration of mestizaje is dangerous. The racial mixture, celebrations have worked to whiten Latin America and condition many Latinos to distance from Blackness and indigeneity. And I think working to spread this consciousness of history, as well as listen to Afro-Latino stories today, can help us in dismantling the racism that comes out of these colonial structures. And I'll stop.
I also wanted to try to add some stuff into just like a personal anecdote that just how you can see the erasure of Blackness even in just day-to-day conversations. I know that as a Haitian woman, that there's a lot of times where I felt kind of hesitant about claiming being Latina or having like my Afro-Latinx identity, because since it is very like Eurocentric and it's kind of synonymous with lighter skin, there have been times where I have talked to my family, even like Haitian friends, where we would see that if I claim to be Latinx, does that mean that I am dismissing my Blackness? Which is obviously not, because that is a part of who I am. And I feel like Blackness has so many different experiences and it's so expansive. And it's not just Blackness experienced in the way just in America. It can be Blackness experienced anywhere across the world. But because despite Haiti having such strong historical and cultural ties with other Latin American countries that sometimes it feels as though when you try to enter yourself into this community, it's almost as if you have to reject another side of your identity in order for it to make sense to people. And the things that were said previously before, I feel like is so interesting, just how much that can trickle down just to even day-to-day conversations just between us. So I'm gonna throw that.
Excellent, thank you. I'm not sure if anyone else wanted to add to that. Otherwise, we can move on to the next topic. Go ahead, Professor Salas.
Yeah, just real quick. One of the people that ought to be studied is, not from a positive point of view, but is Jose Vasconcelos, who wrote the book, The Cosmic Race, very racist book. And he's the one, and I think his official title, I may be wrong, was Minister of Education or something to that effect in Mexico. And when I looked at his background, he went to, I think, UT El Paso, if I remember right. And then I said to myself, well, no wonder he's all messed up. But anyway, back in the day, what UT would have been teaching people is what he learned over on this side of the border. So mestizaje, they've erased the African component in that term. And in that book, The Cosmic Race, and I still hear people quoting from it, I wish they wouldn't, because it's very racist. He's talking about eugenics. He's talking about breeding out of the Hispanic population the darker features, the wider nose, and to make people, like the film showed, to make people come up to a level of whiteness where then you can deny any African relationship. So, and then the term La Raza itself has a racist origin. La Raza Gente originally meant the white Spaniards. You weren't, your blood wasn't, quote, contaminated with the blood of the Moors or the blood of Jewish people. So, and then that term, then we have La Raza Unida Party, and I always felt like they just didn't know. They just didn't know. So, whereas, because they convoluted it or changed the meaning of it to mean the people united, as Raza meaning people. Well, what people? Originally it meant white people or Spaniards.
Thank you, sir. And we do have a couple questions as well. One here is, there is erasure of the Black identity in Latin America, but in America, does the Black identity of Hispanics get stronger? I think that's what the anonymous question was there, or the anonymous attendee's question was, does the identity of the Black identity of Afro-Latinx get stronger?
I have some thoughts on that, but I'd yield to anyone else who might want to, I don't know, maybe personal experience. Okay, well, I'm not Latinx. I'm African American. However, I grew up in New York City. Grew up with a lot of Boricua, Puerto Ricans, and Dominicans on the street, and I grew up during hip hop, which was a very exciting moment, in its birth of kind of really important conversation between Black and brown youth in New York City, creating this kind of new space of kind of voicing what it means to be kind of structurally marginalized as Black and brown youth in post-industrial New York City. And one of the things, and I've done some research, I'm trained as a cultural anthropologist. I work with a community called the Garifuna for some of my master's research. And the Garifuna are actually descendants of marooned, escaped Africans and indigenous peoples of the Caribbean, in particular St. Vincent Island, who now live primarily in Central America along the coast from Nicaragua north up to Belize. And they have a very, very strong African-based culture, religion, identity, and sense of history. Very important. They have their own language, their own music, their own food, and they understand themselves as both being derived of both African background and also indigenous because of the mixture that they had with indigenous peoples who took them in with sanctuary. One of the things that I was working with young people in New York City, because there's a very large community of Garifuna in New York City, and if you would see them walking down the street, you would just assume they were African American because they're dark-skinned brown. And the young people dress like anybody else in New York City, so it'd be very hard to be able to pick them out as somehow Afro-Latino or something like that, or Latinx. One thing that's interesting about the first generation is that the first generation lives the experience of race and racialization and more broadly racism as young people in America. And that shapes how they understand and see themselves as Black, right? And this is true for other African descendant communities of people who emigrate from, the Caribbean or Latin America, where they may not have identified as Black in those contexts because of this idea of mestizaje that wants to figure them everything but Black. But when they come to the United States, they live a particular kind of racism that reads their brown skin as Black, and that becomes part of their identity. So there's kind of an embracement of a kind of Black affirmation in certain ways that maybe was more difficult back in their home countries, right? So this again speaks to the ways in which race as a construction changes and shifts from time and place, right? There's nothing fixed about this idea of race. It is constantly changing, constantly being negotiated. And when people move from different national contexts or cross national lines, their racial classification can change. And that in of itself can shape the ways in which they understand themselves. And I'm just going to start one other little piece of this. I wrote a whole book on the hip hop movement in Cuba, and I was looking at how young men and women of African descent were using hip hop to engage in anti-racist kinds of protests, most broadly speaking. And for a lot of these young people, they would not have been classified as Negro in this racial classification system of Cuba, which is based on a model of mestizaje, of racial mixing. But what they experienced every day was racism. And so hip hop became a new language for them to engage in kind of anti-racist kinds of organizing and advocacy by calling it out for what other people were recognizing, because in the context of Cuba, the official line is there is no racism, right? In Cuba, we're all mixed. The socialist revolution did away with racism. There is no racism, but brown skinned men, women and men are living that racism every day. And if they can't find the language within the space of Cuba to talk about racism, they recognize these other transnational languages, and hip hop becomes that way of engaging in a kind of broader conversation about anti-racism that challenges national erasures of Blackness in the context of Cuba. So again, this idea of the diaspora, the idea of people moving, culture moving, how that shapes the ways that people understand, and also how people have agency, the ability to affect change in their lives by using culture and organizing in different forms of movement making in order to challenge systems of oppression.
I really like what Professor Perry said, but Rania, I think I got your name pronounced right. She made a good point about phenotype. She looks clearly African ancestry, right? But the way the Spaniards used to do it, they had this thing called, I call it a racial stare. When they were trying to decide who was Hispanic or who was Espanol, who was a Spaniard and who wasn't, they would actually start from do visual vetting. They would start with your hair. If your hair had any curls in it, it would immediately send the signal, oh my God, you're polluted somewhere along the line. And then they would go down looking for full lips or wider nose in order to then say, at some point in Spain's history, you could not travel to the Americas. You could not be a priest because they did this visual vetting. And that's kind of what went on with Canary Islanders who supposedly founded San Antonio. Well, they didn't. Yanaguana people were here first, but supposedly founded San Antonio. They were Black Moors who came from off the coast of West Africa. And you could see them being described in the original manuscripts of the Canary Islanders. And they started off at the top, curly hair, darker skin, and the term they used was blobber lips, a configuration of blubber, the old archaic way of spelling blubber, if I'm not mistaken, moving down the face. And so there's this phenotype, there's this fixed thing in people's mind that if you have certain characteristics, you couldn't be Black or you couldn't be Hispanic and so on and so forth. And that, from what I gather, that was invented in Spain, not only by the Spaniards, but the Portuguese were good at it as well.
Thank you. And I know we have a few other questions, and we're gonna, in order to get to the next topic, we're gonna save some of those questions for the Q&A at the end of this session. And so I want to kind of move on to the next topic and revisiting, Rania, something you were mentioning earlier about your family dynamics. We want to talk a little about family and traditions. And so you know, recognizing that storytelling is a big part of passing down knowledge and tradition, how has storytelling impacted research or your experience for the Afro-Latinx community, or your experience as Afro-Latino? Anyone on the panel? Well, of course, for the Afro-Latinos on the panel and researchers and whatnot.
I'd like to start by saying that I feel like a lot of times that what I used to like, I guess the stories that were told to me or feed through like history books when I was like in high school, I feel like storytelling through families was sort of in a way to keep the power in the story, if that makes sense. Because I know one thing that has been shared a lot of times, and I remember it to a T, because every time on January 1st, when we would drink soup jumu and celebrate our Independence Day, that my parents, and anytime I invited my friends, I would always tell them the story of Haitian independence and the slaves and how they used the soup to celebrate the fact that they were free and just celebrate community and just celebrating their Blackness, because they rejected like that colonialism that was hurting them. And I feel like storytelling in the Afro-Latinx communities to, in a way, kind of keep the fire that like our ancestors and the generations afterwards had, instead of like having it flatten out like you would read in like a textbook of, okay, well, this happened and like they freed themselves, and then just kind of tossing it to the side and not realizing just how impactful of a event that was, especially for the victims and for the people that were suffering from that. So that's definitely in a way that family and storytelling happens, because it makes me feel proud to be Haitian, and it makes me feel proud to share my story, versus kind of sitting in this victimhood of, oh, we just kind of stepped out of slavery and then yay, everything is fixed and we just kind of move on from that.
You know, speaking of culture, if I could say this, there are cultural things in, you know, terms of fiestas and things like that, to which someone has taken an eraser and taken it out of history, using an eraser to write history. When we talk about 16, the celebration of Mexican independence from colonial Spain, no one knows, or most people don't know, that the Black president of Mexico abolished slavery and the casta system during the celebrations of 16. So 16 has, Black people ought to be celebrating that too. Black people don't know it, right? Brown people generally don't know it, because it's been erased. That part of history has been erased with a big eraser. So these stories and this music and all of these things have a direct relationship on how we get the real history back in the books.
And thank you for that. And I think I've heard everyone kind of mention that, you know, some of the things we're learning are from stories told in manuscripts or through your families. And so is there, I guess going back to that idea there, is there any other stories, traditions, cultural aspects of your heritage and ethnicity, or your families that has been passed down to you through storytelling?
Curious if Janel has any thoughts to share on that.
Hello, yes, I just been listening to everyone just to hear everyone's background. Mine is a little different. Being Black and Puerto Rican and living in Texas, it's just been a different experience for me, because I am like Afro-Caribeña, and there's not a big community in Texas for our people like in New York. So my experience is very different. I know moving here, people assumed I was either Black and Mexican or Black or white. And it was like, that was like the only mix that they saw down here in Texas. So I also had a hard time trying to relate to Mexicanos because their culture is a little different. And then the African Americans, they didn't really consider me Black because I spoke Spanish. So it was hard. The geographics makes a difference of your experience, I would say, because I know when I go to New York or Florida, I feel like I fit in with all Caribbean people, all Latinos. But in Texas, I think it's a little different, this is why I'm happy we're having this conversation, just hearing everyone's experience. But for me, it's just a little different. Just even being within the Caribbean culture in Houston, they also don't consider like Cubanos, Dominicans, Puerto Ricans, like Caribbeans, because we speak Spanish. So it's just been a journey trying to fit in. So that's just been my experience as an Afro-Boricua in Texas.
Thank you, Janelle. I think a lot of our students might, not to make a sweeping generalization, but I think there's a lot of students at UTSA that probably have a similar experience as you. And even going to the chat, we have a question in the chat, and this kind of goes even to what some of the panelists mentioned earlier about race kind of changing based on how it's constructed. But the question in the chat was, does it make someone less of that race if they have no representation of that race in their family or in their community, even if they're biologically that race? And that, I guess posing that question, it was from the chat, it seemed kind of, Janelle, like maybe something you were also experiencing in terms of your identity and being here in Texas.
Would you like me to add to that question?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Just from your experience. Absolutely. Yeah.
So I would say, regardless of where you are living, like let's say I live in China, I will still be Afro-Latina. So I think it doesn't really matter where you are. I know it's hard when you don't see people like you where you live, but it's also an opportunity to educate people on your culture. So that's what I try to do, but it doesn't take away just because you're not represented in where you are. You're still Latino, whether Black, Latino, whatever Latino that you identify as. I don't think it matters where you live. You still represent the Latinos.
Janelle, can I follow up on that? A quick question, just in terms of not to put you on the spot, but I'm curious. You said that you as a woman who identifies as Afro-Boricua, Afro-Puerto Rican, you obviously have family roots that take you back to the island, and I don't know what the history is there, but you've mentioned you grew up in communities where it's very hard to locate other folks of your particular kind of background. So I'm wondering, your family must have instilled or is an important way in which you root your sense of who you are as a Black Puerto Rican woman. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, because that I think is critical, right? The ways in which identity and culture and community is handed down to us through family and through practice, right?
Yes, I agree. My family has instilled our culture, like with the holidays. We always celebrate. We listen to salsa. I still dance salsa. Listen to reggaeton. We have our tradition. So our tradition has never died, regardless of where we are. Like I have family in New York, I have family in Florida and in Puerto Rico. A lot of them are not here in Texas. So it's just really my mom still instilling the culture in us. But I think regardless if I have family or not, we still embrace our culture. I still feel very Boricua, regardless if I'm around them or not, just because of my family.
And one of the things I just want to pick up on that you said earlier, which I think is also part of the complexities, is that this term Latinx or Latinidad is a very, very broad category that many different groups of people with different histories get lumped into. And so the assumption somehow that's all Latinx people or all Afro-Latinx people are similar is obviously not true, right? These are different histories coming together in this moment in time, right? The question is, how do folks engage in coalitional building? How do people work together, right? But I'll just share a quick experience. I grew up in New York City, and my sense of Latinidad was very Caribeño, right? Very Caribbean, growing up in New York City. And when I did my graduate work, I moved down to Austin, Texas, University of Texas, to do my work. And I just came down with certain assumptions about this kind of a certain fluidity and familiarity with Latinidad because of the kind of Caribbean or Afro-Caribbeanness of Latin New York City, historically speaking. And of course, the Mexican history is very different, right? And so I myself had to kind of step back and learn what it means. What is the space of the complexities of Mexican American, Tejano, Hispanic, Latino, Chicano. I mean, there's all these complexities of political identities that fall even within this space of people of Mexican descent. So again, identity is a very complicated thing, right? It's very, very complex. And these labels that I think Professor Salas started talking about are themselves problematic, right? And we have to recognize that they are problematic. The question is, what do we do with those terms, with those sense of identities in terms of our work in the world?
Yeah, and I might point out that to Janel that these histories, these stories that people tell you, in my case, it's totally different. My grandmother was very dark. My father was probably the skin tone of Mark, but look how I came out. And so what my grandmother used to say, things like, which I detested, she used to say things like, puro blanco, meaning that she was adoring me because I was lighter than her. So, and I'm sure Janel may have ran across that herself, maybe put in different language. But so there's that whole idea of not wanting to be identified as Black by certain people that do identify themselves as Hispanic. But Mark's right, these terms can be very problematic. There is, what I do like about Native Americans, at least in Texas, I asked them, I was speaking before a group and I said, let me ask the Native American people here a question. And this guy stands up and says, I'm not Native American, I'm still an Indian. And then another guy stood up and disagreed with him and said, I'm Native American. They put that label on us. I'm still a Comanche. And so you can see how this stuff, Mark's very right about how it gets very complex in terms of those identifications. And a lot of Native Americans don't want to be put in that big box like they put Black folks. Black folks were Yoruba and Zulu and et cetera, and then they were put into the black box by the slave trade. Europeans are the same way. The Irish became white, and all of the Western European people became white for the purpose of perpetuating white supremacy on everybody else. So that's just another dimension.
Thank you so much for that. And with that, we're gonna kind of flow into our next topic. I know you all talked about family and traditions and kind of what that kind of means and what that brings. In the beginning of this, we listened to some Afro-Latinx music and the influences that come behind it. And so with that, we know that Dr. Perry and Dr. Cervantes, we know you've done research in that area. And so can you share more of what you've learned with the music of Afro-Latinx and how it's kind of come to be about and kind of shaped in with each other and the influences that it has in today's music?
Because I can start out. Yeah, like in my own research, I found Afro-Latino music it's helped shape the history of US music as a whole. As the video pointed out, Afro-Cuban bands like Machito and Afro-Cubans shifted the sound of jazz. US rock and R&B is heavily influenced by Afro-Cuban son. Any Latino music, salsa, bachata, merengue, reggaeton, all Afro-Latino music. In my own work in Black and Brown cultural overlap, I've researched son jarocho, which is an African indigenous music that originated in Veracruz, Mexico. It's still played today. La Bamba is a son jarocho song. Zapateado is a dance style from son jarocho that is practiced in ballet folklorico today. Regionally, if we look at Tejano music, Selena actually acknowledged Afro-Latino influence on her own music when she was alive, specifically cumbia and reggae. So it's important to understand Afro-Latino music has heavily shaped Tejano culture. It's important to preserve these roots and teach this history beyond surface celebrations and to more critical examinations on how those musical forms came to be. So rather than just let's enjoy and celebrate this music, where did this music come from? How can we trace these histories and learn more about how these music musical forms became popularized here today. And also hip hop, as Dr. Perry mentioned comes out of South Bronx, New York, where Afro-Latinos played a central role. Hip hop would later become the literary and musical culture for generations of Chicanos like me, and has provided a medium to engage in Black and Brown political and solidarity and love. But there's a lot of work to do, and I feel it's essential to honor Afro-Latino people and culture and our moves towards social justice.
I might just add, in terms of even the birth of jazz, I'm actually speaking to you from New Orleans, which is where I'm currently reside. And jazz is an American art form. It's certainly an African-American music form. However, part of its early sets of conversations are what was called at the time the Latin tinge, or the Latino element, or really the Caribbean, Afro-Caribbean component to jazz music, because New Orleans, from the beginning, was a French colony and was tied much to movements of people, ideas, culture throughout the Caribbean basin, which includes large parts of Spanish-speaking Latin America, in particular Cuba, as well as Haiti. Haiti, very, very important component of that. But early jazz was this kind of mixed match of like all these cultural elements, and part of it was important histories of musicians traveling from Havana, Cuba, to New Orleans as a port, but also Veracruz, Mexico. There was a lot of transit between those spaces. And so those cultural elements became early components in this formation of this music that we now called American jazz music. So even from the very beginning, right, this music that we celebrate as quintessentially American and really African-American in a lot of ways, owns part of its roots, its raíces, right, to larger sets of conversations throughout the Circum-Caribbean area with Spanish-speaking people, right? So that Latin component is there. And of course, that conversation continues in the evolution of jazz, right? A very important figure in that history is a man by the name of Chano Pozo, who was a rumbero from Havana, Cuba, who was also a member of the Abacuá, which is a sacred Black male society, Afro-Cuban society, who comes to Harlem and gets connected with Dizzy Gillespie and introduces all these Cuban roots and rhythms to Dizzy Gillespie, who then incorporates and works with him together to produce all this music with his big bands. And that becomes a critical moment of like launching a whole Latin jazz kind of history. And again, it's this person, Chano Pozo, who is a Black Cuban man, deeply part of Afro-Cuban religious and musical traditions, that brings that language to Harlem, which is the mecca of all these kinds of conversations, that contributes to this ongoing conversation between Black and brownness that produces something as beautiful as jazz. And of course, hip hop just picks up that conversation, a handful of decades later, between Puerto Rican youth, African-American youth, and other Afro-Caribbean folks coming together and making this beautiful thing called hip hop. And then I wound up in Cuba decades later once again and see how young African descendant men and women are again turning to hip hop to engage in this kind of political voicing, critical voicing of their experience, their knowledge, their understanding of themselves as Black and Cuban, but also as being Black as part of the diaspora in a global sense, right? And so one of the things that, of course, is important in all this conversation about Afro-Latinidad is this idea of movement, that people are constantly moving, right? We're talking about Afro-Latino communities, Afro-Latinx communities. They're immigrant communities. They're coming from somewhere else. They're crossing, they're moving, they're engaging, they're evolving, they're training. They're part of this conversation, right? So the movement and circulation of ideas and people and culture is critical to understanding, obviously, the Afro-Latinx community and history, but really, obviously, the broader history of this country, right? Clearly.
Yeah, and I might point out about the immigrant situation, that's and thank you for that, Mark. Man, you and Marco, you got the music thing down. and I'm thinking about phenotype, and I'm looking at Janel, Mark, I bet you've experienced this in Louisiana. So Mark, I'm looking at your phenotype. You must be a mulatto. Janelle, you would be a mulatto. I might be an octoroon if I'm lucky, or quandroon if I'm lucky. and so these different classifications are really mind-boggling and racist for the most part. So these are problems with the old white supremacist way of identifying, forcing a system of identification in the minds of people like a nightmare almost, because it creates nightmares. It creates problems of association and integration into whatever going to consider yourself to be. And then the whole discussion of acculturation, using a psychological term or an anthropological term, is avoided. Because you're right, when we talk about immigrants, when we talk about, trying to do a given 11 million or so many million of people citizenship, we tend not to think of those immigrants in any way as being Black, when roughly about 20,000 of that 11 million, I think it's more, are Black. They're part of this diaspora in some cases, and sometimes they come in straight from Africa. Sometimes they come from Jamaica, but they're part of that group of people who are coming into the country as immigrants, but they're not being identified as Black. They're just being put in the Hispanic category in the minds of people who are racially oriented.
Yes, thank you. Thank you everyone for being able to continue to have us grow within our knowledge of the background and all of the experiences. I know that Janel, you had mentioned a little bit about your family and a little bit about, dancing salsa and kind of what's that like? What was that like growing up and having that, was that something that your parents did or your family did often? Like, how did you learn to enjoy it and to want to dance it?
Yes, thanks for bringing that up. I actually wanted to discuss salsa and our culture and how it influences all Latinos and even non-Latinos. So I would say with salsa, that's my culture. So I grew up dancing salsa, listening to salsa music. That was just part of my life. I didn't think it was different. And it wasn't until when I moved to Texas and I dance salsa. I'm very involved in the salsa community. I actually even come to San Antonio for the salsa festivals. I like to travel to different salsa events. But I think it's funny, people do ask me like, wow, how did you learn how to dance salsa? And I think it's always a funny question because they don't think I'm Latina. They just think I'm Black or African American. And I always have to tell them, well, it's part of my culture. I'm Puerto Rican. I grew up dancing salsa, listening to salsa. I learned in my living room. It's just part of our culture. I don't take classes to learn salsa. So I feel like people, they learn from that. You got to educate people, not necessarily get offended by it because some people just don't know. So I always take those opportunities to educate people, and they are usually very interested. And I've had influenced a lot of people to learn how to dance salsa, learn more about it, introduce them to music and the history of salsa. And, there's a lot of African roots in salsa, the music, the rhythms, it's all African roots. So it's very interesting that I get to share that with other Latinos who are not with an Afro background. And I think it's just very interesting in Houston too, being with a lot of Central Americans, like they love salsa. And it's like something that I feel like we can all share, even if you're not from Puerto Rico or Cuba or have African descent. But I think music like salsa, reggaeton, merengue, bachata, all the Latin music, I think that's one positive thing I can say, that it can bring all of us together and to learn about each other's culture.
I could just add something real quick just about music and Black communities, and this is not peculiar to African descended communities, but all African descended communities, music is very, very central to a sense of community, right? It's used historically to bring folks together, right? The music calls folks to come together and to celebrate, right? One of the things I often, I teach a course, African American cultural expressions, and I talk about the Black church, and, I ask my students, what do you have to have? In most Black services, music is very central to the worship, to the engaging the space of the spiritual. And that is brought from Africa, the relationship between the drums and the idea that the drums speak to or cross over from the physical world to the spiritual world, and how central that is to people coming together and healing through music, right? But it's not just spiritual in this kind of formal sense. It's also that when Black folks get together to have parties, one of the things we always have to have is music. And again, this is not peculiar to African Americans or African descended people, but it is something that is very, very central to the way in which Black folks create community, build community, maintain community, and heal, right? And transcend. Music is very, very central. So in terms of, again, building community, sense of identity, music is very central. So I really hear what Janel is saying about the role of music and her family in terms of salsa and other kinds of music as a central way in which the family comes together to kind of celebrate themselves and to really build and maintain community. And the centrality of music in that for African descendant communities is very, very important.
I just wanted, sorry, to add to
Yeah.
that. Because the second that Professor Baird talked about how it was with celebration to bring together community, it made me think immediately about, because I live in North Carolina and there is a small Haitian community here, but it's not really easy to find Haitian people, and it's also not easy to find like Latinx people here really at all unless you know somebody. And I remember that in school, in my university at NC State, that I had to dig to find a way to join the Latinx Heritage Month Committee. And a lot of times whenever we were planning events and we just wanted to try to get a chance to talk to each other, there would always just be this togetherness when we would play music from our personal countries to share. And we use that music to like and relate in the fact that, oh, these drums sound very familiar and it sounds like something that would be played in music that I hear in my family and in my house. And we would use it as a way like, oh, this is how this would communicate my experience and how could I maybe learn a bit from your experience from your music as well. Because there'll be times I would play like Racine, which is a Haitian word for roots. And a lot of times it would help in storytelling about spirituality, and it would just be telling in how Haitian communities like to communicate maybe more taboo things like voodoo in order to kind of share some things that maybe our words can't communicate as well, but we could kind of feel it in our soul, how much more connected we are.
Yes, I could not agree more. I'm actually from Maryland, but I moved to Miami for about 4 years. And so I have 2 left feet, but everyone there is like Cuban, Colombian, Venezuelan. And so it does bring a community together because whenever I was with them and we had celebrations or parties, it didn't matter if I couldn't dance at all. It was just a good time, a great time to bring people together. And so I really felt that community and that celebration of just wanting to have a good time and just enjoy each other's company. So I definitely can relate. And I love that the way that music is able to bring people together and also teach people about other cultures and traditions and learn through music. It's just it's a definitely one of the most beautiful ways to learn a culture. I appreciate so much the knowledge and the experiences that you all bring. I think we do have some questions in our Q&A, and so we'll get started on that just right now. So I'll pose the question and anyone else can hop in. One of the questions being, what impact would expanding the knowledge of Afro-Latin connection have on activism activities with our current political atmosphere? It's a tough one, but anyone can hop in to start us off.
I'll take a stab at that because I'm working closely with some of the Black Lives Matter groups, actually about 12 of them, very closely with them. And what the coalition of Black Lives Matter groups is doing is embracing the diversity of all people and understanding, and there is I think a fantastic understanding or consciousness of the fact of how racism serves as a dividing tool amongst people, so that you get crazy comments like, all lives matter, so Black Lives Matter don't matter. Black lives don't matter. So, but because of the diversity of the Black Lives Matter movement and bringing in all these different people, Afro-Latinos, Afro-Latinx, all kinds of people, there's the new world order is what we're going to call it, right? Is we're seeing the deconstruction of racial biases, racial paradigms taking place in the streets of America. And that's very important because that changes the dynamic all over the place. I mean, who would have ever thought that UTSA would have a Black Lives Matter class like we did? Who would have ever thought that? Who would have ever thought that who would have ever thought that we'd be having this conversation like we're having now if we were not living at the edge of a new world order of deconstructing all of this racial miseducation that we've had. So it's a definite relationship in terms of the educational components. Also, that being translated into the streets of people, of young college students who are hearing these messages like we're giving today, and then taking them out there and making them a reality in an anti-racist struggle.
I wanted to add that I had saw a post on social media that said Latinos for Black Lives. And I thought that was a little, I don't know what's the right word. To me, it was kind of excluding the Black Latinos, because when you say Latinos for Black Lives, it says that there's no Black Latinos. So I thought that was something that we also need to be aware of, how we word things, because that to me was excluding the Black Latinos. Yep. I mean, the intent was good, but it was also excluding the Black Latinos.
If I might, Janel, I'm going to talk to you like a real Texan, whatever the hell that means. In the past, because for political purposes, Mexican Americans were given on their birth certificates the label white. And that was done especially down in the valley, where political bosses needed Hispanic votes, Mexican American votes, to win an election. So they went down to the courthouse and changed their racial identity to white. And you still have Mexican Americans identifying themselves as white. So for the sign to appear, Latinos for Black Lives Matter, I would look at it as a progressive, as a progression. We got to move them forward, like what you're suggesting. They don't need to stay stuck there. But it was a progression, because they were told, in Texas especially, not to care about Black people because we're white, is what they would say in the Mexican American community. So that sword cuts in two different ways. We do need to move them a little bit further, right? But in my opinion, that was a progression.
I understand Janel's point, in part saying, again, this idea that Afro-Latinx folks are somehow invisible, right? That you're Black or you're Latinx, and there's no crossover between those spaces, right? And the reality is it's not the reality. And I think increasingly as young people, this new generation who are in the streets and are engaged, particularly Afro-Latinx folks, are in a sense, they are challenging exactly what I think Professor Salas is speaking about, this kind of, or they're challenging the deconstruction of these artifices that separate these communities, right? And those separations, those divisions are intentional. As again, I think, Professor Salas just pointed out that race was used as a wedge and still is used as a wedge between different communities of people so that folks don't come together. Because when united, we're much stronger, we're much more powerful. So there's a long invested history in creating divisions and cleavages between people of, let's say, Mexican descent and people of African descent in the context of the United States. And what Afro-Latinx folks do, by your very presence, by your very history, by your very voice, is that you challenge, you break down those false barriers between these things that separate us. And in some ways, you folks have a leading role in some of that work, because you point out the absurdities of these categories that want to split people into these artificial camps, when in fact, we all have, at the end of the day, the same struggle, right? We're all here to build a more equitable society, and we're all, in a sense, marginal in one form or another. So this challenge, this Afro-Latinx presence, this voice itself, is part of the struggle to break down those kinds of divides and challenge really white supremacy, because that's how white supremacy works and maintains itself. It keeps everybody else divided and fighting amongst themselves, right? Or it sells off parts of itself to people like the Irish, the Jewish, the Italians, right? Or even white working class folks who were given whiteness as a way for them to disidentify with Black working class people, right? Identify with your race, not with your class interests, right? This is how white supremacy works. And we've seen how that worked and how that's working today in this kind of Trump moment, right? And we're not in a post-Trump moment yet, but he came immediately to power by saying, look out for those Mexicans coming across the border, those rapists, they're coming after you. We white folks need to come together and protect ourselves from these invaders. And that is the oldest game in the book. And the tragedy is it continues to work. And so we need to continue to dismantle it.
I'll make it a point to make some Afro-Latinx posters the next time I go to a protest and make a few people that might not want to carry it. but because both of you are absolutely correct. We need to move people forward at every chance we get.
Yeah, I want to just make a quick comment. I mean, I think that the comments here speak to the miseducation here in Texas. I mean, I think Chicanos, Mexican Americans have a lot of work to do in understanding the complexities of Blackness and Afro-Latinidad. I think a lot of it starts with education. I know education isn't the only thing, but I think it's important, you know, also our cultural expressions, listening to stories from friends, colleagues, learning as much as we can about Afro-Latinidad and Blackness and the varieties and the diaspora. As a scholar, I mean, it's easy for me to sort of theorize, but I think it's also just really critical to hear from real people. And it's essential to gaining an understanding of the realities of Afro-Latinos. And I think this panel is an example of where we can be going and where we can continue to form union solidarities to fight anti-Blackness and colonization as it still stands and plagues our society.
I was gonna just small comment about the fact that when it comes to like recognizing, I guess, like the Afro-Latinx community, especially when it comes to activism in today, I definitely do think that it helps in strengthening our understanding with each other, but even more so, by recognizing in these activists, whenever you are an activist, when you recognize just how expansive identity is and how expansive a race is, you're recognizing the humanness behind a person, because you're not putting such a, I would say, like a very shallow blank slate on someone. And by understanding their humanness, it makes you want to work more and understand that person more and do a lot more for the community, rather than just slapping the sticker, just Black, and not realizing how Black looks so different, sounds so different, and just expresses themselves in such a different way. So I definitely wanted to add that towards the end.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think we might have time for one more question. There's some amazing questions that we have within our Q&A. But I know you all touched up on it a little bit, but for the Afro-Latinx on the panel, what helped them become more comfortable with their Blackness / Afro-Latinx identity? I know Janel talked about it a little bit. I mean, you all mentioned a little bit on, it depends maybe where you live, your environment, the people surrounding you, but what helped you feel the most comfortable with those identities?
I would say, I think it takes a lot of, like, I guess, foundational look back that helped me feel a little bit more comfortable. I think it started with trying to understand my history a little bit better and understanding where I come from. I think by having that strong foundation in my identity, and then on top of that, I think it helped me by just digging and searching for a community, because there was a lot of times where I felt very alone in my thoughts, and I felt like I was the only person that was questioning whether or not I fit in this category. Do I fit in this category? And just kind of feeling like pushed and tossed around because I didn't have other people that could also tell me, no, you're not crazy. This is kind of, they're making you feel this way. It is okay to feel this way. And you're a lot more than just these boxes you can check. Like, and they kind of helped me realize through the way that we're similar, but also in the ways that we're different, just how I can accept myself in my identity and how I can find other people to also help support me in the community to accept myself.
You know, to me, everybody ought to take the time to go and dance a little salsa. Or, you know, Marco's kind of humble. He knows how to play this stuff, but, or listen to him play some stuff. Everybody ought to take time to do that. Everybody ought to take time to go to a Black Baptist church and hear that music and hear that spirit come out. And we have to, I think, spend time to culturally educate ourselves to these different cultures. And it takes time to do that, but it's very important. And the more you spend time looking at other cultures, bringing them into your own psyche and your own spirit, the more you're going to have an anti-racist philosophy. And it just sort of sinks in at some point that racism is a horrible thing, and it's a tool to divide people. It's a tool to destroy people's integrity and respect, even for themselves, creating self-hate in some cases, or hating other people because you haven't immersed yourself in other cultures. And so that's something that's very important to do.
Thank you.
I would like to add, just to take these opportunities instead of being offended of comments or questions, just to educate. Because I know when I was younger, I used to be offended, like, really? You really think that? Why are you asking me this? And it's just really take a moment just to educate. And I think that's people's intents aren't to really hurt you. They're just curious, and just take the opportunity to educate them on whatever the question is, because they're really just interested.
I think two people can, I think two people can read, right? Folks can seek out information about these communities and about these histories. It just came across my radar. There's for instance, a website called hiphoplatina.com, and they have a whole page that's dedicated to folks using TikTok who are Afro-Latinx, talking about the complexities of Afro-Latinx identities, using TikTok as young people to communicate with each other. So there is community out there, even if folks can't locate folks down the street, there is community on the internet. There are ways to read, there are ways to educate yourself about these histories that have been largely erased for very real kinds of ways, right? So I always tell my students, there's a reason they call it his story, right? Because it's always the victors who write the official story of the past in order to justify the present, right? Our work, right, as deconstructionists is to find those histories that have been otherwise erased or marginalized or silenced and lift them up and become part of that work, right? So again, the resources are out there. Even if you physically can't have access to communities, you folks, young people, are all incredibly skilled at engaging into the internet and building community virtually. So that's a resource for folks to reach out. And I do want to give one quick plug for those students who are on this call. I appreciate you folks so much. I just want to say next semester in the fall at UTSA, I am teaching a course on the African diaspora. So that's one place where you can choose, if you would like to come and engage in conversations to broaden and expand on some of the questions that we raised today.
Real quick too, you can go to Facebook. There's this Facebook page called Afro-Latino, the Untaught Story. That's another pretty good site if you're not familiar with that one.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. And that was going to be kind of like the last question. If there were any specific podcasts, or I know Dr. Perry, you talked about the TikToks or anywhere that you all have gotten knowledge, or anyone else on this call, if you have any resources that other people could join in to continue to learn more about this conversation. It has been so amazing to have all of you here today. This is a space that is very much needed and to bring to the surface, and not only for people who are in the Afro-Latinx community, but for everyone else to still understand the history, the culture, and the beautifulness of how the blending came together. So we thank you so much for being a part of our panel today. I super appreciate it. I know others do on the call as well. And so before we wrap up, I do have the contact information of our panelists. So if at any point you want to contact them, learn more, or just get and connect with them, here's their contact. But thank you to everyone and to our amazing panelists for taking time to share their experiences and their knowledge and research with us today.